Good morning, I'm Dr. Martin. Welcome to the Institute of Regenerative Education. For all of you that don't know, I'm Dr. Scott Martin. I'm an interventional pain doctor by training. I'm the medical director of the Institute of Regenerative Education. My role is education, peer-to-peer training, and research. Now, today we're going to be talking about what I think is something a little glib, right? And I don't say that lightly. I see this thrown around all over the place. Wolverine protocol this, Wolverine protocol that. Ugh, it's exhausting. So we're going to put some teeth into it. What do I mean by that? Well, I went to a conference this weekend and I spoke to a lovely group of nurse practitioners at something called the Symposium at Sea. That was about 200 nurse practitioners, and there was a large group called BHRT, and they do a wonderful job training on bioidentical hormones. That's the main crux of their education and teaching. And it was 3 very full days of education, most of the day Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And this term got thrown around quite a lot. Wolverine protocol, Wolverine protocol. And I've heard this used by other stem cell companies who are offering a quote, Wolverine protocol. Now, we see this very commonly in terms of peptides, right? And people will do a peptide stack, meaning that you just combine 2 peptides, right? They combine BPC 157 and TB 500, and suddenly that's the Wolverine protocol, right? You know, I'm a little adamantium, little claws come out, and suddenly I'm going to run around and, you know, I'm impervious to bullets and gunshots and being stabbed and having like my face sliced open. No, it doesn't mean any of that. I just, it's tiring, right? I see all these peptide folks and they're running around and, you know, peptides for this and peptides for that. And no one makes any sense of any of it. And maybe that's my archetypal frustration. You have 5,000 peptide gurus running around and they can tell you anything you want to hear about peptides because they're reading from a screen, right? Hardly any of them have actually even memorized the content. They just have a green screen that they're reading behind their camera, and you can tell because they're not looking into the camera. Kind of similar to the lecture that I was at. I mean, everyone just read from a screen. I watched a lecture on ozone. I mean, I was dying in the lecture because I've never seen such claims in my life. Just simply get ozone in contact with the tumor and boom, it knocks it out. Never have to worry about cancer again. ALS cured, MS cured, you know, this infection, that infection, long COVID cured. We just knock it out with ozone. It's profoundly irresponsible. And it's not any different than what I see with peptides. Hey, let's just ratchet up a whole bunch of Retatrutide or Reta. You got all these young kids running around buying Reta from God knows who, spending all of their parents' hard-earned money for this peptide, and they think, oh, you know, I'm going to put on a bunch of masks and I'm going to cut at the same time. This is all nonsense because it isn't grounded in any science, let alone research. Now we have very little in the way of research. And so what I'm going to say, because I say this all the time, and we'll put it in red because it's that important, right? The FDA is our friend. And all of this is experimental use. All of this, right? I am not saying we can diagnose, treat, cure anyone with this. And so if this is something you want to run in your clinics, lovely. Understand this is experimental use. Now, when I approach things, I approach them mechanistically. That's the only way I do things. If it doesn't make sense, why would I do it? If I can't have that protocol repeated in another provider's office, why would I do it? If one provider in Southern California can't get the same outcomes as a provider in Plano, Texas, or in Manhattan, New York, why should anyone do it? And I sat through 3 days of lectures, just vomiting information. And no one put forth a protocol. Now, I understand why no one did it, right? Because you kind of have to actually risk something to actually put together a protocol. You have to kind of put your name behind it. If I just give a lecture and I just say a bunch of stuff, even if I quote an article or two, there's no risk in that. I'm not putting my neck out there. All of you know me. I don't put my neck out there. I put my whole body on the chopping block, and I hand the executioner the axe or the broadsword. Because if I'm going to lecture, if I'm going to educate, someone has to actually, number one, see the forest through the trees, and number two, put something down as an elementary place to start and a common sense place to start. You will always hear me say, I'm a big fan of start low, go slow, because the tortoise always wins the race. The hare doesn't win the race. So let's look at the Wolverine protocol the way Dr. Martin would do it. All right? If I want to look at this, a Wolverine protocol, well, I need some mechanistic paradigm first. And you've all seen me do the Martin triangle. And this is going to be a subtle nuance on the Martin triangle. And so if I use that same paradigm where I have a triangle, and this really works almost like a tripod, right? If you remove any of these elements, the whole thing collapses. Well, at the core of this Wolverine protocol should be muscle preservation. The bottom left is always going to be inflammation. Now, uniquely, in particular, because my wife is an endocrinologist and singularly brilliant, and if you haven't seen or read her book, it's by the Dr. Hormone Hacker. It's the type 0 diabetic. I consulted with my wife before I did this because I'm not an endocrinologist. I'm not a diabetologist. My wife knows this stuff intimately. She lives it and breathes it. The third pillar here is actually insulin resistance. Why? Well, if I maintain muscle, I preserve insulin resistance. If I downregulate inflammation, I maintain insulin resistance. And why is insulin resistance so very, very important in this day and age? Well, let's think about it. Conservatively, 32% of patients in the United States are diabetic or pre-diabetic, are diabetic or pre-diabetic. By 2030, we're looking at 35 to 37%. By 2050, there's a very good likelihood that over 50% of the US population will be diabetic or pre-diabetic. This is terribly important. And if we ignore this, this whole paradigm collapses. Now, in the realm of muscle preservation, modulating inflammation, meaning down-regulating inflammation, and trying to preserve insulin resistance, this is a process. Now, you've all seen kind of our protocols that I put together through the IORE. They're predicated on 0, 4, and 10 weeks. This is going to be very similar. What I did is I built a Wolverine protocol based on 0, 4, and 10 weeks. I did the same thing. And so let's figure out how we would do that. At time 0, what would I do? Well, I want to start holistically. I want to start naturally. And the way my wife starts every single day is my wife starts with protein, meaning her first meal of the day is high dose protein, 25, 30 grams of protein, whether that's eggs, whether that's yogurt, whether that's a protein bar, a shake, it's always protein. And protein should be 0.8 times ideal body weight. Now, not to worry, you don't have to write all this down because I've done all the work for you and it will all be referenced below this lecture. So you don't have to write all this down, just listen. All right? What else is essential as a foundation at time 0 for the first 4 weeks? Well, if protein's important, so is exercise, and not just any resistance training. 3 to 5 times a week. I don't need you in the gym on the treadmill for 2 hours. I would much rather you do resistance training with some weights 3 to 5 times a week, even if it's 15 minutes a day. This is far better for you and you will burn more calories. Now, what else can we do from a foundational level? Well, sure, we can do an anti-inflammatory diet. We can add in vitamin D, which is a profoundly good thing to do to stabilize insulin resistance. What else can we do? We can add berberine. Can we do anything else? Well, absolutely. If we want to maintain muscle and we want to balance insulin resistance, and we have a high protein diet, we're doing resistance training, right? We're adding vitamin D, we're balancing insulin resistance with berberine, we should also be looking at essential amino acids. Because they are a core building block for us to preserve muscle. You know, everyone's running around, TB500, BPC. Yeah, that's all fine if you have the core building blocks to actually build muscle. If you don't have essential amino acids, what exactly is the BPC 157 and TB500 working on? If you don't have enough protein in your diet, what are these peptides working on? They're not working on anything. So let's give them some fuel for the love of God, right? Now, we're doing this for the first 4 weeks because we're priming the pump, right? Sleep architecture is terribly important, right? And if I'm going to recommend something for sleep, it's always going to be magnesium. Magnesium is lovely. I would take it about an hour before I go to sleep. Notice there's no peptides in this. There's no biologics in this. This is all very over the counter. Nothing crazy, right? Because we need to prime the pump. More importantly, much more importantly, if you can get a patient to do this before you start them on peptides or biologics, you have an invested patient. You have a patient that's creating a lifestyle. They're creating habits, healthy habits. Everyone talks about this Wolverine protocol as something I'm going to do to a patient. Well, what the hell about having a patient do for themselves? If the Wolverine protocol is 100% reliant on biologics or peptides, what if they can't afford those anymore? What if they lose their job? What if they lose their insurance coverage? They're just not going to be healthy anymore, right? Let's set out some simple, comprehensive, basic steps that can be reproduced by anyone in the United States, anywhere in the world, right? And they can get all of this off Amazon. You can learn how to do resistance training off Amazon. You can buy a little book, handout, You can go on YouTube, right? This is just a simple calculation, right? And figure out how much protein you need to consume and just do it. Start your day with protein, the way my wife does. Anti-inflammatory diet, you can do a chat search or a Google search, and you can figure out that maybe it isn't an awesome idea for you to go to McDonald's and get the Big Mac extra value meal and then go across the street to Chick-fil-A and get a large or an extra large strawberry shake. That's not helping you a whole lot. Vitamin D, you can get on Amazon. Berberine, you can get on Amazon. Essential amino acids, you can get on Amazon. Magnesium, you can get on Amazon. This is all really easy. Okay, what do we do at 4 weeks, right? We're going to put 4 weeks over here, all right? At 4 weeks, now we start to introduce supplements that are a bit more potent than these, all right? Where am I starting? I'm starting with inflammation, all right? So I'm starting curcumin. If any of you know me, you know that I got sued by Bayer Pharmaceuticals for creating a curcumin-based product. Massive lawsuit because I created a supplement that worked better than drugs. We all forget, right, in this society where so many people are dying from all sorts of things, COVID-related incidents, cancer, narcotics, fentanyl. Prescription narcotics kill about 100,000 patients a year. Over-the-counter and prescription NSAIDs kill over 250,000 people a year, notwithstanding the fact that NSAIDs are catabolic. They break down collagen. They break down tissues. If you want muscle preservation, insulin resistance, and downregulation of inflammation, this has to be an anabolic paradigm. It can't be a catabolic paradigm. So what are you going to use? You're going to use curcumin, all right? Now, my preference is curcumin as Mariva. Mariva makes one of the best bioavailable sources. Thorne makes one, some other companies make one. I don't have any stock or any shares in Mariva, but they make a fabulous product. Now, after I'm down-regulating inflammation, right, and I'm looking at all of these things, what can I do at this point in time, right? If I'm looking to balance insulin resistance and preserve muscle, well, I can also maybe add a GLP-1. Now, I prefer to microdose. Whether that's, Ozempic, whether that's compounded, whether that's Retta, whether that's compounded, start low, go slow. Nobody needs to lose 5 pounds a week. I don't think anybody needs to lose 3 pounds a week or even a month. If they're losing 1 to 2 pounds a month, that's perfectly reasonable because you can maintain that and not develop sarcopenia. Remember, anyone who's on a GLP-1 will unfortunately lose mass, and 40% of that mass, by studies consistently over and over again, is muscle. 40% of the weight loss is muscle. And how do you modulate that? Well, essential amino acids. Where are they? Essential amino acids will mitigate some of the sarcopenia from a GLP-1. Now, in that I'm introducing peptides, all right, here is where I might consider, if they've done this for 4 weeks, adding other peptides. I already have a GLP-1, right? Now, if I wanted to add another peptide, would I immediately add TB500 or BPC157? I wouldn't. Why? Because this is so important. When we are talking about this Wolverine protocol, the word is really homeostasis. That is what we're looking for. We're looking for homeostasis. That's at the top of this whole protocol. And what is the biggest contributor to homeostasis? Immune support. So if I was going to add anything in here, I would add thymosin alpha 1. Okay? I know. All right. Dr. Martin, come on, right? I really want to add in my BPC. What about sleep? You said sleep was so important. Can't I add in Samorelin or Tesamorelin? Please understand, this is a process. If you want patients to do well, then you need to walk it through with them in a patient-measured process. Now, if you're going to be a wellness clinic and you're just there to ring the register, fine, throw anything you want at these patients. You're going to lose them. Because some doctors are going to actually practice medicine. And because they're actually going to practice medicine, they're going to make patients jump through some hoops. You all may have heard me talk about a group out of Shreveport, Louisiana, 2 very young providers who are, in our Facebook group. I learned this lesson from them. They make their patients jump through some crazy hoops to qualify their interest to even be part of their medical practice. Well, hallelujah, amen. Somebody's finally doing it. Somebody has finally realized what we've known all along, that the doctor-patient relationship is a 50-50 one. You need to have buy-in from the patient if you actually want to get them better. And if you don't have buy-in from the patient and you just get buy-in from their credit card, they may be a patient for a couple months, but they're not going to stay in your practice for years. And you're going to operate like an MLM. You will have to replace that patient every 3 to 6 months just to be able to stay afloat. Maybe slow everything way down. Maybe build some resilience from your patient first. Maybe build some trust and confidence with baseline elementary peptides first, and then go for the gusto. Now, what does going for the gusto means? At about 10 weeks is when I start to get a bit more nuanced, right? If I want to downregulate central inflammation, I might add exosomes. And we're going to address something here, right? I might add at this point in time, if the patient hasn't been sleeping consistently on magnesium and we've stabilized inflammation, they're starting to lose weight. We're stabilizing their overall immune support, but they're still not sleeping well. This is when, at 10 weeks, I might add Samorelin or Tesamorelin. If they're starting to lose weight, they're eating ideally, they're starting to do resistance training, at 2 months, what do I start to get? I start to get some muscle hypertrophy. Now we're in the game, right? At 10 weeks, I'm starting to get muscle hypertrophy. All of that resistance training that they started 10 weeks ago is finally paying off, right? All the protein that they're eating, the essential amino acids they're taking, down regulating inflammation. It's stabilizing insulin resistance. It's building muscle. Fabulous. Now we have a foundation. Now, if we want to, we can add our BPC. We can add our TB500. All right? Specific sidebar on exosomes. It is becoming very, very popular to use exosomes by sub-Q application. All right? And people are doing this in concert with a, quote, Wolverine protocol. They're doing TB500, they're doing BPC 157, and they're doing that IM, and in another shoulder or in a gut or an upper outer hip, they're doing sub-Q administration of exosomes. All right? This is very experimental, of course, right? Sub-Q application of exosomes is simple, it's easy. If you want to do that with, a product like one of Platinum's, you can use Nano Air, reconstitute in 1 cc, all right? 2-3 cc's is just a ton of volume to try to give sub-Q. It's painful, right? I've had communication with, Platinum in they're kicking around, potentially releasing, maybe a 10 billion exosome, and that may be in the works, something that can be reconstituted in a 0.5 cc of saline, or even 1 cc and given sub-Q, and it can be given, on a monthly basis, again, to systemically down-regulate inflammation, not to treat, not to cure, right? But I need everyone to understand how this is being done. There is no, well, I'm going to give exosomes and somehow or another, it's going to serve as a vehicle or carrier. So my TB500 and my BPC can then dive into muscle sarcomeres and dramatically improve muscle health. That's not how it works, especially given in disparate sites, right? If they're compounded together, maybe there's potential there, but it would have to be made specifically that way. What you're doing when you give exosomes, either nebulized or sub-Q, by down-regulating inflammation, by creating an environment of homeostasis, you increase the bioavailability of the peptide and the likelihood that the body is going to receive that well. If you are in a terrible mood and your wife comes up and she says that, she wants to buy a new car, you may not receive that well, right? You may receive that horribly, right? Now, on the other hand, if you're in a great mood, your business is booming, and your wife or your spouse has supported you through all of this, right? And she's suffered through the long nights and the early mornings and been there to take care of the kids when you were at work early and at work late and on weekends, and you missed the soccer games and the football games and the pickleball matches or whatever, right? And your spouse says, I'd like to get a new car. If you're in a more balanced mindset, you might say, baby, let's go shopping. Let's make it about you for once, right? Well, that's kind of what happens when you use BPC 157 and TB 500, and you use it in an environment when you're down regulating inflammation and you're creating a system of homeostasis. The problem is that you can't cheat your way there. You can't force it. I see so many people like, walk in off the street, bang, BPC 157, bang, TB 500, bang, exosomes, you're going to be amazing. Really? Are they going to be amazing? They sleep poorly, their eating habits are trash. They have 5 cups of coffee or like 15 Celsius a day. They go through a bottle or 2 bottles of wine a night. They're traveling, they're all over the place. Are they really going to do well? In my estimation, if you're going to use a term like a Wolverine protocol, it damn well better be comprehensive. It should be patient-centered, not product-centered. It should be experimental use because we're not treating anything with this. And you should do it in a structured and in an evidence-based manner such that it can be repeated in your practice. You should go into the IORE.com, www.iore.com, and you should download one of our observational study forms. I would encourage the musculoskeletal one, right? where with 15 questions that you would document after a patient signs a consent form at 0, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, you get an objective measure of how that patient feels. What is their disability like? What is their pain like? How is their sleep? How is their mood? This would be an ideal way to determine whether my Wolverine protocol, we're going to call this the Martin Wolverine protocol, right? Whether this actually works or not. This is completely experimental, right? I was like bouncing around on a cruise ship for like 2 days, trying hard not to vomit. And so what did I do to distract myself? Because there's nothing else to do other than eat, exercise, and try not to puke, right? So I just ate what I could, exercised as much as I could, and thank God didn't vomit. But I read a lot. And I read around this quite a lot because everyone else was just throwing nonsense out there with no measured, predictable, protocol-driven way to actually achieve any reasonable outcome in the patient. If you want to try this in your practice, my strongest encouragement, start low, go slow. Build habits in your patients that they can trust so that they don't have to be on all this other stuff in perpetuity. If your patients just do this, all of this they can get over the counter. Maybe add curcumin, right? They can get all that from Amazon. They're going to be infinitely better than they are right now. We start adding in other things like a GLP-1 that should be monitored on a regular basis, right? Add in maybe thymosin alpha-1. And then at 10 weeks, a reasonable, rational period of time where we start to see early muscle hypertrophy, then improve and augment sleep only if they're not sleeping well with magnesium. Then add BPC 157, TB 500 if they're not recovering the way they should while they're exercising as their weights go up in resistance training. Then add exosomes if their workouts are getting more aggressive, if they're being more active, and they're not remodeling inflammation in a sufficient way by doing all of the other things that don't require exosomes. Too many providers are rushing in the quick fix lane. They merge onto the highway and they just Asian drive right through traffic, straight to the fast lane on the left, throw their hands up in the air and hope they don't get hit or kill God knows how many people on the highway, running across 5 lanes to the fast lane, and then slam in peptides and maybe exosomes or God knows whatever else to try to be trendy, to try to catch the wave. And they've never been in the water. They have no idea how to paddle. They're not measuring anything. They're not tracking any outcomes. They're not doing any preliminary testing. Understand the foundation under all of this should be, number one, a very comprehensive physical examination, as well as a very comprehensive lab screening, right? Do a function health panel. Order a big panel and understand what you're dealing with. Correct any vitamin deficits that happen along the way, right? Make sure hemoglobin's balanced. Make sure sodium and potassium are balanced. Make sure there aren't occult infections in these patients because you don't know, they just walked in off the street. Look for methylation issues. A common sense approach to biologics, to peptides, should have its root, its foundation in behavior modification and in reproducible, evidence-based, holistic paradigms to achieve homeostasis. Look, Wolverine protocol's hot. It is. But it will burn you if you don't know what you're doing. I'm Dr. Martin. Have a very blessed day.